Okay. 3, 2, 1. Alright, so this video is about trophic levels. We are still looking at how energy moves through an ecosystem. So let's start by defining trophic levels. So a trophic level is any organism that occupies the same position on a food chain. So what I mean by that, if we look over here at this grass, alright? So this grass is going to be in that first food chain, but we could also have, for example, a tree might occupy that food chain, maybe an apple. So really, any sort of vegetation, any sort of thing that produces its own energy, so any plant, could be in this trophic level. Here we have a grasshopper, so this is here because grasshoppers eat grass, but we could have any sort of thing that only eats plants. So you could have like a goat. That's not a good goat, but you get the idea. That's a goat, apparently. I'm smiling. So you could have a goat that's in that same trophic level. You could have a rabbit. There we go. That's a pretty good rabbit. You could have a rabbit that's in that same trophic level. And this is going to keep going on and on and on. Things that are in this same level are in the same trophic level. And we'll see some more examples of that. So again, food chains, they show the path of energy from food to eater, as I like to say. And our trophic levels, they're just another model that we can use to show how energy moves through an ecosystem. So these trophic levels, they do a lot of cool things. They show that energy is passed through a system from the producer. We're about to learn all about producers, but plants and algae are good examples of some producers that you might know about or you might learn about. And this is really important. All food chains have at least 3 trophic levels, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. We're going to skip past this think, pair, share, and I'm just going to go ahead and let you guys know 2 things. So first of all, bottom layer, this isn't labeled on here. Let's just put producers there, and they get their energy from the sun. The sun. So the sunlight shines on producers, and it goes into those little tiny plant cells that look something like this, and those little plant cells have chloroplast. And the chloroplast in here does photosynthesis. So they take in that sunlight, and they actually make sugar. They make a little, it's called glucose. You don't really need to know that, but in case you're interested, they make glucose. So this sunlight comes in, and it makes all this nice tasty sugar. And then we have our first group, our primary consumers. So our primary consumers are things like this mouse, this little cricket, the honeybee, moth, caterpillar, and ant. So these are only eating plants. They're just eating plants. Roots, vegetables, leaves, grasses, things like that. Then we have our birds. So we have our toads. We have this cute little bird, and we have this sort of bigger rat. And they're going to be eating our primary consumers. Then we have our tertiary consumers, these snakes. They're going to be eating our secondary consumers, and our quaternary consumers, all at the top, they're eating our snakes. So if we look at this like a food chain, it's kind of like this. Food to eater, food to eater, food to eater, and food to eater. And there's a really good reason that the shape of this is a pyramid. And you're going to see that at the very end of our video, why this is a pyramid and what's significant about this area at the bottom being so much bigger than this little area at the top. But let's just look through this really quickly. So we have a couple trophic levels. We're going to look at 4 trophic levels for the most part. We're not really that concerned with quaternary. We really just want to do producer, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So our producers, they make their own food, sort of like a producer in music industry makes music. They make food. They make things. A producer makes things. So an example of that would be like a plant. I'll draw a little flower here. There's a flower, and it's getting its food from the sun. The sun comes in, and it gives this plant, this little flower, gives that energy. Then we have our primary consumers. And these consume producers. So I'm just going to put a PC for primary consumer, and I'm going to attempt to draw a little mouse here. There we go. That's a little mouse, and he's got his fat body and a tail. So our little mouse here, he's going to eat, yum, that plant. So we draw from the food to the eater. Our primary consumer eats that plant. Then we have our secondary consumers. So a snake, who is going to eat our mouse. And then finally our tertiary consumers, as a hawk, who is going to eat our secondary consumers. So it's really just food chains, just with some more detailed words. Let's look at producers first. So producers, they harness energy to produce food. They make their own food. That's super important. We're also going to use this word autotrophs a lot. So autotrophs, they can make their own food using solar power or chemical energy. And let's just break that word down for a second. Auto is like self, and troph has to do with food. So self-food or self-eating, an autotroph, they eat themselves. They make their own sugar and they eat themselves. My examples here are plants and algae, which are using energy from the sun to make sugar, which is, that's food. Okay. Next up are the primary producers. So these consume our producers. These are primary consumers. They eat the producers. And we have two main types of these. We have herbivores. So you might also know that as a vegetarian. And they only eat plants. Or we have omnivores. So our omnivores eat plants and other organisms. That's most of us. I'm an omnivore. So an example, a mouse or mice eating seeds, so that's an herbivore. Or humans that eat vegetables and meat, that's an omnivore. Now we have our secondary consumer. Our secondary consumers, these are organisms that consume primary consumers. So we have gone from producers to primary consumers. Now we are at secondary consumers. We're just going to draw a quick food chain type arrow in. So our secondary consumers, these are the carnivores. These are animals that eat other animals. And it's not healthy for a human to be a carnivore. We get all kinds of nasty diseases and things in our bodies kind of stop working right. And we just end up sad and maybe dead. So eat your veggies. Broccoli is good. The example here, snakes that eat mice. So a mouse, if we draw this arrow in, a mouse is getting its energy from a plant. And the snake is getting that energy from the mouse. So we have two little bounces. Here's bounce 1, and here's bounce 2. And it's easy to find that because we just look for that secondary. Secondary means 2. So second level consumer. Finally, we have our tertiary consumers. These consume the secondary consumers. So our hawk is eating a snake. Let's put in this whole food chain now. So our hawk eats the snake. Our snake eats the mice. And our mice eat the plants. So it's the whole food chain now, and let's label the pieces. So we have producer, we have our primary consumer, our secondary consumer, and our tertiary consumer. Alright, we're going to skip another think, pair, share. We're going to jump ahead to decomposers. I love decomposers. These guys are so cool. So decomposers consume dead organisms and other organic waste. And by organic waste, I mean poop. So they take dead things, and they take poop. That's a poop. And these are what? These are not cool. We don't like them. But they do their little decomposer magic. Here's a mushroom, and here's an earthworm. And what they make is wonderful stuff. So they break down all kinds of nutrients and materials, and they recycle them back into the ecosystem. So I've given the example before how when you're dead, you're kind of more alive than you were when you were alive. So imagine we have a deer, right? So this deer dies. And let's say our deer dies, and a bunch of bacteria, a bunch of fungus, and maybe a bunch of earthworms start living inside that dead deer. So it was once one organism, now it's got 1,000 organisms living in it. Okay? So our deer's dead, and it gets broken down, and it makes this dark spot on the forest floor. And this dark spot has a lot of nutrients. And then there's this spot over here, just a regular spot, where nothing died, nothing was broken down. We have a plant that releases seeds. So 2 seeds land here, and 2 seeds land here. Where do you think the plants are going to grow better? In this place where the deer died and all these wonderful nutrients were recycled back in? Or over here where nothing has died and nothing's been cycled back in? Our plants are going to do way better up here. They're going to be huge. They have all these nutrients. These ones, they'll be little baby plants. Okay, so here's another way to look at recycling matter. So we have our producer. This is the grass. Our producer, the grass, is eaten by the grasshopper, our primary consumer. Our snake then is going to eat the grasshopper, and our hawk is going to eat the snake. If our hawk dies, it'll be decomposed by fungi, and those nutrients will go back to the grass. But it doesn't just have to be the hawk that dies. If a snake dies and isn't eaten, it'll go to the fungi. If the grasshopper dies and it isn't eaten, it'll go to the fungi. And if the grass dies. So all of these things can go back through that cycle. These nutrients are always being cycled over and over and over and over and over again. In fact, some of the nutrients in you might be from dinosaurs. Which is awesome. It's really cool to think about that. There's also this video right here. Really cool video. It's about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes long. It's got a really good display of how decomposers work. It's also important to note that if, well, not so much that one, but it's also important to note that if my grasshopper poops, or my snake poops, or my hawk poops, those will also come over there and join the fungi and be broken down into wonderful stuff. We got 2 more really important concepts to cover today. The first one, where does the energy go? So energy we know is passed up the food chain from lower to higher. So, you know, producer to primary consumer. But only 10% of the energy at one level is available at the next, and that decreases each time. The reason for this is 90% is used for metabolism or given off as heat. This is why food chains can really only have 4 levels, and I'm going to show you an example of that. This really makes a lot more sense if we look at the examples. You can always rewind the video to come back and look at the slide. So let's start here. Our producer, right? Our producer has 1,000 units of energy. Our primary consumer only gets 100 of that, so 10%. Our secondary consumers only gets 10% of that. Our tertiary consumers only get 10% of that. And then finally our quaternary only get 0.1 unit of energy when we started with 1,000. Another way I like to look at this, if I draw up this big paper here, alright? So imagine this is all the energy that plants can offer. These are the producer's energy. Primary consumer comes along and it eats, right? So all it has left for it is this is it. This is the only energy that it gets. It only gets that part that's still boxed in. The rest of this was used by the plants for their metabolism. They gave off heat. It was used to keep them going, maintaining a homeostasis, all of that. So now we have a toad comes along, and it comes and it eats that caterpillar that ate the grass. Well, the toad is only going to get that much. So we're getting less and less as we go along. We start with that giant piece of paper, that almost covered the entire page, and now we only have this little sliver, but we still have a ways to go. Next up, we have our snake. It's going to come along, and it's only going to get that little tiny bit. That's all it's going to get. And then to close it all off, we have a hawk comes along and eats the snake. And that's bigger than really it should be. I'll shrink that down. This is what's left for the hawk when we started with all of this food. And that's pretty crazy. It really makes you realize that it's important to eat low down in the food chain. So I actually want you to think about this one. We're going to do this math together. So if corn has 500 units of energy from the sun, how much do we get from each ear of corn? So we draw corn here, right? This has 500 units. We know that only 10% is going to go up to me. So what's 10% of 500? Well, we just take 500 and multiply that by 0.10, because I'm just going to take the decimal point and move it over twice. And that's going to be equal to 50. So I get 50 units of energy. Another way I like to think about this, here's my primary consumer. Primary producer has 500. Here's my primary consumer. Here's my secondary consumer. Here's my tertiary consumer. So I'm just moving that decimal point over as we go. Another thing, in the US, when we raise our animals, usually chickens and cows, we feed them corn. So let's go with this analogy again. If we get 500 units of energy, we'll put UE, and we go this up to just put a cow here. That's a cow. Only 50 of that's going to go to the cow. And then again, we have that 10%. We would only get 5 units of energy if we ate the cow, because we're only getting 10% of that. And that's really not very much. Our last big slide here is about biomass. So it's the total mass of organisms at each trophic level. I'm going to draw on my pyramid here to help you guys visualize this. I know I mentioned this earlier. So we have our producers, which that's the biggest part of the pyramid. We have our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and then our tertiary consumers. So there are a ton of these. I mean, just huge numbers of producers. I like to think, if you look outside, you're pretty much guaranteed to see a bunch of trees and grass and stuff. I mean, you're just going to see these things. You'll probably see maybe some bugs, especially in the summertime. You'll probably see a lot more primary consumers, little things that just eat grass. You might see some frogs, but you really have to look around for it. And it's not very often that you see snakes or eagles or things like that at the very top. Those are very rare. Rare, common. And these are in between. So the big takeaway here is species at lower trophic levels have a greater number than species at higher trophic levels. And I mean, that kind of makes sense. I think there are 7-ish billion people. And maybe something like, I don't know, 40 plus, maybe more, probably more, billion chickens. Because we're above chickens in the food chain, and we need to eat a bunch of chickens. Finally, to summarize all of this up, trophic levels model energy moving through an ecosystem. Energy and biomass decrease at each trophic level, and we just have, really quickly, our trophic levels put as a food chain. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section. Please let me know what's good, what's not good. I want to make these as useful for you as I can. Alright, have a nice day.